So Andreas and me, we will be talking about the Climate Action Tracker Fair Share methodology. And to give you some background on the Climate Action Tracker, the Climate Action Tracker is a scientific project since 2009 from two Berlin institutes, the New Climate Institute and Climate Analytics. And it tracks climate action towards the Paris Agreement target. And one of its main outcomes is this thermometer that you can see on the right-hand side now. And this shows the implied warming of countries' actions, such as, for example, countries' NDCs, which would lead to 2.5 warming by the end of the century, according to our calculations, or also countries' current policies, which would lead to 2.7 degree warming by the end of the century. So as you can see, this is quite far away still from the 1.5 Paris Agreement goal. Another big outcome that we have is that we also assess countries' fair pathways and also feasible pathways. And in this talk today, we will introduce to you the methodology that is behind computing these fair emission pathways of countries. As you all know, like climate targets should be fair, and this is part of the Paris Agreement. It says that NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions, should consider the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities of countries. But there's no agreement on how such a fair contribution should be defined or should be computed. And because of that, scholars and government experts and also civil society have contributed many different approaches on how to compute such fair emission pathways for countries. And some of them are very contradicting, actually. And so there is a problem on consensus. And what the Climate Action Tracker, so the CAT, is therefore doing in its methodology is it's taking into account all these different approaches and tries to find a synthesis from them. It tries to take them all into account and produce one emission pathway that is fair for each country. And yeah, in this next slide, I want to give you like a short background on these different approaches and why there are so many different approaches. And one reason why there are so many different approaches is because there are different principles that are underlying them. And these principles can be categorized according to this paper from Höhne et al. 2014. And I've listed some categories here. So one category is responsibility, and approaches in this category, they say that emission reductions of countries should be higher for countries which have more responsibility for global warming. So countries which have higher past emissions. Another category is capability, which says that emission reductions should be higher for countries with more economic capability. Some other approaches say that emissions should be equal per capita for all. And there are some other approaches that I'm not listing here that, for example, also take into account the right to development. But there are also approaches that we at the CAT do not consider as equitable, such as these approaches from the cost-effective category, which consider least cost pathways as equitable. But these we won't take into account. But yeah, because of these different underlying principles, the fair emission pathways can look quite different. But another reason why they can look quite different is also because they can be computed or implemented in a different way. And there are basically two approaches for computing fair emission pathways for countries. One approach is allowance sharing. And there the idea is that the remaining carbon budget, the remaining allowances to limit warming to 1.5 degrees are shared in equitable way among all countries based on these different principles. And the other approach is to share the burden, to share the reductions that are necessary in an equitable way. And here the burden is basically defined as the reductions that are necessary to go from a hypothetical business as usual scenario down to a 1.5 compatible pathway. And yeah, to now share either these allowances that are remaining or this burden that is necessary in an equitable way, usually we use indicators from these different principles. So an indicator for responsibility would be the historical emissions, because this basically represents the responsibility of a country. Whereas the GDP of a country would be an indicator for capability. Okay, so now because of the reasons that I've discussed now, there are many different emission pathways that are fair in the literature, and the CAT is trying to take them all into account. And we try to take them into account by defining the so-called equity range. So we take all the approaches from the literature, or most of the approaches from the literature, and they give us allowances for each country, and then we map them on a line as shown here. These crosses are different fair allowances from different approaches for one given country and for the year 2030. And as you can see, they are quite different. They span a range. And from this, we define the so-called equity range, which for us is where the majority of data point lies. So we exclude some allowances that may be extreme. And this is now the equity range for a given country, but different countries will have different equity ranges. So of course, like countries that are more capable, they should have equity ranges that lie near lower emissions, but also countries with higher responsibility have equity ranges that lie near lower emissions. But then on the other hand, also countries which are bigger, that have a higher population, they of course have higher equity ranges. Yeah, because of these different reasons, countries have different equity ranges. But of course, what we are interested in is not like a range of fair allowances for a country, but one specific fair allowance value for a country. And yeah, therefore we have to somehow like reduce this. And it's also interesting to note that this range for each country is quite wide. So if every country would choose the upper end of its range, which corresponds to the allowance that is most suitable for them because it gives them the highest allowance, then we would reach 4-degree warming. Whereas if every country would use the lower end of its range, which is the most like the strictest approach that exists in the literature for them, the world would end with something like 1.2-degree warming. So this range is really wide, and we have to find like a value, like a point in this range that is somehow fair and also respects a certain temperature target that we're interested in. And we're usually interested in like, limiting warming to 1.5 degree, or maybe also to 2 degrees warming. Yeah, so how do we get to this value? And for this, we define the equal level of ambition. So we want to respect the individual circumstances of countries, which are given basically by this equity range. But to find a specific point in this equity range, we ask for an equal level of ambition. And what we mean by this is we ask for that all countries take a comparable position within their own equity range. So for example, in this figure here, all countries are at, let's say, 75% of their equity range. Yes. And then, but as I said, we are then interested in a certain temperature target. So we have to then vary this comparable position, the 75%, to maybe to 50% or like to other values to find the value where we limit warming to, let's say, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And we have to do this for all countries at the same time because all countries together influence the global warming. Yeah, and Andreas will now go more into details on how we do this.
Okay, so yes, also welcome from my side. Please, I'm sorry for my voice. I have like a mild cold. Yeah, so far, as Luzie explained, we needed for like assessing like the individual action of a country, we always need to assume what other countries do, because we can only make a picture, like we can only relate it to global warming if we have like the global picture. Therefore, we have this equal level of ambition. And I think that is in the beginning a bit strange, but it basically makes assumptions how like that countries act like similarly. And this is just like an overview, what happened. So from the whole pipeline. So as Luzie explained, we start from this fair share data set, which is coming from literature, and we want to come to a rating scheme. So on the right, you see what the climate action has defined as like the different rating levels, and it's basically defined by temperatures. So the Paris Agreement compatible is like the green one, and then we have 2 degrees, and then actually go in 1 degree temperature steps up. And yeah, we name them appropriately. But basically what you need to know is basically that these categories are cutting in that fair share range, which is a relative scale for each country. So you put all countries on the same relative level. So when we go to the next slide, yeah, as you've already realized, this is all like quantification, which is very technical, and I'm sorry that this continues like that, because now we need to find a level which is actually consistent to this temperature levels. And as also Lucy mentioned, now what you've seen in this range, we actually now need to repeat for all countries where we have data. We use baselines for small countries where, for example, we don't have any equity data. And then we also do that for in 10 or 5-year steps. So we do that for 2030, 2040, and 2050, and get like a level, like 3 levels where we can interpolate. And then we add like historic data. And then we also need to do like an extension to 2100, because the framework where our climate model works, this works basically from the past to 2100. And then with that one, with historic and an extension, we get like a full data set for a country. And then again, we do aggregate all these country emissions to like a global pathway. So there's a summed allowance pathway plus an extension. And this green pathway, of course, depends on what level we choose in these ranges. To complete the picture, we need to add land use and land use change emissions, because they are historically a bit detached from national emissions. And also bunkers data, which is defined like as aviation, international aviation in international shipping. So these contributions are basically held constant while we look at what nations need to do. And with that one, we basically get a Kyoto gas pathway. But since our climate models run with various gases, we basically have a statistical estimation scheme, which then gives us all the different climate active gases. So for example, methane and nitrogen oxide. And with that one, we have a reduced climate model. So these are not these models which run for like a month, but this actually runs in a few minutes. And this gives us a complete warming trajectory. And these small models are basically calibrated to mimic the big models, but we can actually run that a lot of times. And for example, then we have to, on a mathematical level, define what is the Paris Agreement level, and we define it as like a peak warming of 1.5 with a 66% chance. But for example, we relate to the IPCC, so there are other definitions, but it's basically you need to like mathematically formulate what you say, what is achieving 1.5 or like the Paris Agreement. And basically with that one, you get like an iterative loop where you can lower these levels until you actually reach a target which you want. So on the next slide, you basically see that, like as I said, we are lowering these levels until we see globally we reach a target, and we can basically color or map these ranges for every country. So above 3 degrees, below 3 degrees, and then 2, and then actually like a 1.5 compatible range for every country. And basically now we go back to the country and actually look and compare it with the provided NDC of a country. So now we flip this basically from a horizontal to a vertical bar. And then on the next slide, I give you an example, for example, for the EU. So this is basically now a result. So this bar you see is including the fair share range, and it's colored. And then on the black, so I'm sorry, this is from the website. It has a lot more information, but in black you see the NDC target, and it's falling in this orange range. So this means when all countries would go to the same NDC level, so basically the NDC of the EU defines the level of ambition. So we put all other countries on the same level. And with that one, we would achieve a global warming which is below 3 degrees, but it's actually higher than 2. And therefore, it's in the orange range. And like very low you see in where the border is to the green, this would be actually what we would consider for the EU to be fair in an equitable way. Just to put it in context, this is the right side of our rating. This is based on fair share, and it also has like a climate finance component. But I just want to mention that in the current rating system of the climate action tracker, this is only one part. If you go to the next slide, there's another part which we call based on model domestic pathways. And we do this because, like in the beginning, Luzie said that we exclude this whole perspective of cost effectiveness and feasibility and what is technical possible. This is basically put to another rating. This rating, I just briefly say, this is based on integrated assessment models, and it purely talks about what is technically feasible on a domestic level. And the overall insufficient rating would be like a combination of two. But what we presented so far is only like the right side, but just that you have like the full picture. So on the next slide, basically as a conclusion, what I want to, what you have to hopefully take away from that talk is that we try to synthesize existing literature and define like a relative scale between countries, so to make like a mitigation action comparable. And in that range for countries, we identify what levels are enough to, for example, achieve a common target. But it's very important to state that like just being in that range is not enough, because this is for all countries the most favorable approach, and this is not leading to 1.5 compatible allowances. And the climate action tracker basically can rate existing NDCs, and sadly, most NDCs are lying in the 3-degree category, or like 2 degrees. As we know, this is all not sufficient. And then we also provide what allowance would be compatible to 1.5 emissions. It is important to say that the equity framework is a quite theoretical one. So it provides, or it suggests very negative emissions sometimes. So for example, for Switzerland, we like the 1.5 level is very like suggests very negative emissions, and therefore we interpret that these emission reductions also include like financial support for other countries, for example, not in the domestic boundaries. Last year or the year before, there was a big update from the IPCC report, which provides new modeling data. And therefore, we are currently working on an update for our rating scheme. And we are also working on a new publication, which will provide the methodology in more detail. And if you want to find more on the current methodology, I just put like the link to our website where we stated basically again what I showed you now. And with that one, I want to thank you all and for the chance to present here. Also from the whole team. So this is like work of a lot of people. So we're very happy to present that to you and that you are interested in it. Thank you.